Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're dialing in from. I'm John Drayton. Burns is national lead for zero-emission mobility. And we have a great panel here today. We're going to be talking about innovative contracting solutions to electrify heavy-duty fleets, or actually to move heavy-duty fleets to zero-emission. We'll touch on a little bit of hydrogen here as well. We've got a great panel here for you. I'll introduce everyone in just a minute. But a little bit of background here on what we're going to be talking about. Fueling or charging a fleet is a key operational feature for any fleet, but it's typically not any fleet's core business. The core business is moving people or moving packages or delivering packages. So it's actually quite natural to talk and explore the idea of contracting out this fueling or charging as a service. To be more precise, contracting out your fueling or charging operation has many names. P3 or public-private partnership. Some people call it fueling or charging as a service or an alternative service delivery option. If you're getting really fancy, we might refer to it as a DBOM, a design, build, operate, maintain, or an FDBOM, which includes financing. So our panelists are going to help us explore many of these concepts a little bit further today. Now, we all talk about P3s like they're new, but I've actually been in the P3 business since the 1990s. P3s and contracting out fueling or charging is not a new operation. I was at LA Metro when we were developing a CNG fleet there. And at the time, we built up what was for a time the largest natural gas fleet in North America. And actually, we're second only to Beijing in the world. Our bus fleet would grow to over 2,500 vehicles, all on CNG, working out of 12 operating locations. Incidentally, Trillium, who's here, was one of our first contractors who did P3 fueling as a service. So they were actually the first firm I reached out to. We have a 25-year relationship with Trillium. Hi, Kimberly. So was really delighted to have her on the panel. So what you need to know is that there are a number of potential advantages to going to this type of contracting solution for your charging or your fueling needs. In LA's case, we looked at this as a way to accelerate how quickly we could build out infrastructure. But using a P3 for CNG actually saved us money and improved fleet's reliability. In the 25 years that LA Metro has contracted out their CNG fueling service, they have never once failed to fuel a bus because the P3 contract didn't work in 25 years. In fact, in all three areas, going to a P3 for CNG fueling saved money, it accelerated the rate that we could build out infrastructure, and it provided a more reliable operation. With that, let me introduce our panelists here. First up, we have Sangeeta Ranade, and Sangeeta is the Vice President of Energy as a Service for Alpha Structure. Second up is Irina Filipova, the Chief Operating Officer for Electrify. And last is Kim Okafor. Kim's an old friend, General Manager for Trillium. I'm going to let them all introduce themselves. But before we get started, I wanted to also note, while it wasn't intentional, we have three really impressive women on this panel. So how cool is it that we have leading industry practitioners here, and it's 2023 and it just feels normal? So good job, everyone. Anyways, with that, our first up, we're going to talk, and let me make sure I've got this in order. We're going to ask you to describe your company's business model, and we'll go through, describe your company's business model, an ideal client situation. What are the advantages to having an outside firm managing your charging and fueling resources? And our first up will be Alpha Structure. And if you can just cue me through, I will try and keep up with the slides here. So Sangeeta, you're up.
Thanks, John. I appreciate the introduction. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine.
Great. So John, if you want to flip to the next slide. So Alpha Structure is a joint venture between the Carlyle Group and Schneider Electric. And between both of them, they have either funded or built over 300 microgrids around the world. And in their experience, what they found is that each project was highly customized and resulted in a set of assets that might have been challenging for a customer to manage on an ongoing basis because it's just not their core business. And so they created Alpha Structure to really be a turnkey owner operator of these assets. So I just used a lot of buzzwords. So let me just break that down. By turnkey owner operator, what I mean is we actually take over this scope of work from beginning to end. So that's everything from designing and financing to constructing to owning and operating. And when I talk about assets, what I mean is everything from, say, on-site generation of energy to support the business, to the charging and charge management software, to the vehicles themselves. And it can also include the facility that all of these assets are housed in. And so we can really look at this quite broadly, depending on what the need is of the organization. And the reason why this felt like it made sense in the market today is because lots of customers either don't have the capital to invest in this type of infrastructure, but probably more importantly, they don't have the ability to focus on managing these assets. It's just not core to what they do. And there's a level of complexity that goes with it that they are looking for another provider to take on for them so that they are not saddled with all of this additional business risk. So if you flip over to the next slide, I think the easiest way to explain this is with an example. So Montgomery County is one of our partners where they've made a commitment to electrify all of their fleets by 2035. And the first facility that we electrified is what you see here. And it's a combination of assets. So clean energy generation with solar and storage, also baseload generation to help them on their journey to net zero. So it starts with ultra efficient natural gas to move from a business as usual to a low emission environment, and ultimately transitioning to renewable natural gas or hydrogen when it becomes available. And all of it is highly digitized so that there's good visibility into how every aspect is operating so that it can be monitored and issues can be dealt with very quickly so that every single vehicle leaves with the state of charge that it needs at the beginning of each shift. And, you know, when John talks about the business structure around how to make this work, it really looks like a power purchase agreement, but we call it an energy services agreement because it has a little bit more flexibility in it. And what I mean by that is we can produce additional commodities. It's not just production of power. It can also include production of hydrogen. This site doesn't produce hydrogen, but the next project that we're doing with them does. But it can also include other performance indicators like the state of charge of vehicles or how quickly the site can flip over into island mode if the grid were to go down. And there are financial penalties that are associated with each of those so that there is a really clear framework for making sure that that risk is appropriately transferred and the customer knows what they're buying. So this is an example of how we do energy as a service, or sometimes it's called infrastructure as a service, to help customers transition their fleets over to new alternative fuels. So with that, I will pass it back to you, John.
All right, thanks. That's a great overview. And these are going to sound similar. All these presentations are going to hit similar topics, but you're going to see that each of these firms has a slightly different business model they're going after, and we're going to dive into that a little bit deeper in a minute. So next up here, Irina, I'm going to give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, John. I appreciate it. Great to be here and have such a fantastic audience today. You can go ahead and start with the next slide. So Electrada is a new entity on the market. We're only about 3 years old, backed by BlackRock, a small investment firm you've never heard of. And our value proposition in the market is really to deliver electric fuel to our fleet customers. What that means is that today's transportation manager understands how to operate with conventional fuel. And the transition to electric transportation should mean the same level of ease and ubiquity of electric fuel as has been the case for over 100 years with conventional fuel. Obviously, this is easier said than done, and achieving that delivery of electric fuel requires connecting a lot of fine points in the process. So we define charging as a service as really a full-scale solution, from capitalizing the entire process on behalf of our customer to then delivering that operations and maintenance post-commissioning. There's a lot of focus in the market right now on just the front end of how to deliver charging infrastructure reliably, as well as other energy assets on site. There is, I would say, less emphasis on what happens post-commissioning. And what we've seen in this marketplace is that reliability has been a key obstacle to wide-scale fleet electrification, especially for heavier duty vehicles. If you go down to the next slide, please, John. This really describes really where a lot of the fleet managers find themselves today. We call it the DIY trap. A lot of large companies and entities, organizations, public entities are used to doing it themselves when it comes to infrastructure projects. And unfortunately, charging infrastructure oftentimes is thought of as just another set of appliances to procure. However, as Sangeeta has just shown us, and certainly in Electrada's case, those assets, energy assets, are very complex, not only from the design and deployment standpoint, but also from reliability and maintenance standpoint. So we challenge our fleet partners to think whether or not fleet electrification should indeed sit in their core competency, since energy hasn't necessarily been a part of transportation logistics business, and now is becoming very much part of how fleets need to be thinking about the future. So we come in with the view that the complexity around technology, energy, the actual cost involved in this transition, as well as interoperability between various pieces of this value chain, creates so much complexity for any one organization to try and address it on their own, that they do need that third-party partner, that expert, to come in and solve this for them in this CaaS or electric fuel model. We not only emphasize the fact that capital, or removing capital requirement for the fleet, is an important component of the process, but it's also, of course, ensuring that reliability, 99% uptime in our case, that really delivers that incentive for the fleets to transition. So to summarize, and if you would flip to the next one, please, John. Electrada really takes care of all the componentry that are described on the slide, from fully capitalizing the solution to ensuring SLA-backed performance, to reducing that cost per mile for the fleet. We absolutely have to beat the cost of conventional fuel per mile, otherwise the transition makes little sense. And really thinking about partnership in a very long term, because as this conversion roadmap progresses, we have to be very conscious and cognizant of the fact that there are different components that need to be put in for a 10, 20, 30 vehicle depot versus a 100 vehicle depot. So that long-term success and planning is very important to the success of our model. We completely remove operational risk to the fleet operator. We take all of that risk upon ourselves, and again, deliver that reliability over long term.
Thanks, Irina. And by the way, I love the comment, reliability is not a commodity. For a fleet operator, it doesn't matter what the fleet is, reliability of these systems is just fundamental to the operation. And a lot of times people from the outside don't get how near and dear that is to an operator's heart. All right.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, Kim, I believe you are up. So Kimberly Okafor.
Let's do it, John.
All right.
You can switch over to the next slide. One, I want to appreciate, or I appreciate everyone's time in spending time with us and hearing about the different contracting options that you have. I want to start by saying it's hard to talk about Trillium without talking about our parent company, Loves. When you think about Loves, you think about the over 600 truck stops that we have across the country, but we're far more than a truck stop. And one piece of the Loves family of companies is Trillium. And if you move to the next slide, Trillium focuses on all of the alternative fueling options. And we provide different contracting schemes and mechanisms for each one, like the ones that have already been discussed today with a P3. One of our first P3s was with John and over in LA Metro, and helping them to build out their fleet of, thousands of CNG buses across the city. But we have opened up our scope of offerings from just CNG and RNG, but also to include renewable diesel, biodiesel, hydrogen, and EV. So the way that we refer to ourselves is one partner, any fuel. In the next slide, I want to start to talk about some of the experiences that we have in the 3 alternative fuels that Trillium really focuses on. The first one is CNG, RNG. We have a network across the country. Some of these stations are owned and branded as publicly accessible Trillium or Love stations, but the majority of them are backlot. And this is where we get into that contracting mechanism, that contracting scheme that I was talking about before. But the goal of a fleet is to make sure you're moving people and moving things. You don't want to be the fuel provider for a CNG, RNG station, or if you go to the next slide, for a hydrogen station. So working with an organization that has gone through all of the phases of a D-bomb, like John was saying, and being your fueling resource is what's really important. We've built some hydrogen fueling stations. The first one was a liquid hydrogen station for the Orange County Transportation Authority. The second, that was a liquid hydrogen station. The second station was an electrolysis station. So generates hydrogen on site for Champaign-Urbana Mass Transit District. The next phase of that project, they're deploying solar arrays right now. So it'll be fully 100% renewable hydrogen. And now we're going through the designing for a third station for North County Transit out in San Diego, California. So all of that experience is what's really helpful in providing a contracting scheme, a contracting mechanism to make sure that you can fuel your trucks and your buses in a way that makes sense, because you don't want to turn into a fueling provider. You want to keep the same business plan that you've been having since the beginning of time here. So the next slide really goes into our EV charging experience. And the same contracting mechanism goes for whatever fuel that we're putting in. What I will say is our EV charging experience is at this point limited to light duty EV chargers at our Love's truck stops. Our plan for the years to come is to grow out that network. And really why I put this in here and how is it relevant and how it's relevant to heavier duty fleets is that everything that we learn while we're putting in the charges for light duty is really going to be directly translated to what we do for the heavy duty space. It is going to be more power. It's going to be more power than we've ever used at any of our truck stops before. It's going to be longer charging times. How do we reduce those charging times? How do we increase reliability? All of those things are the things that we'll be learning on our own network and be able to share with our fleet partners. So I guess all that to say, working with a partner like the other ladies that have spoke before me that have the understanding of how to deploy fueling infrastructure in a way that's reliable, safe, and engineering and sound from an engineering perspective is extremely important. So I appreciate your time and look forward to the questions, John.
So, and just to emphasize a kind of different point here, a lot of your work, Kim, is private sector and private fleets. It's not just public sector. This construct is, while we call it a public-private partnership, it really works as well for private entities that maybe don't want to have the hassle of having the responsibility to reliably operate a charging infrastructure or fueling infrastructure.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right, I'll move on. So regarding EV charging, what applications and market sectors are better or worse for battery electric charging right now, and discuss a little bit, and I'll go through in the same order, Sangeeta, Irina, and then Kimberly. What are your key markets today, such as transit or drayage or school buses? What are potential emerging markets that you're looking at, such as maybe long haul trucking or airport ground support equipment. Where are your companies focused right now? So Sangeeta, you've got the floor.
Sure, thank you. So right now we're very focused on transit agencies, ports, and also private sector fleet operators, because they've made their purchase or they put in their orders for vehicles or electrified equipment, and it's coming. Even if there are delays in the supply chain, they're still expecting these to come. And so they're starting to see that there are more constraints in the system. Like Kim mentioned, these sites are starting to use more power. They're planning to use more power than they ever have in the past. And so there's a really unique opportunity to support the overall organization in building out the full range of infrastructure that they need. So those are some of the areas we're looking at. There's certainly a lot of dollars going into school districts as well. And so I think that's another area where there could be opportunity. I think it really depends. Some sectors are more primed to use an alternative business model than others. And so it may take a little bit longer to unlock some of these sectors because they have to have some statutory hurdles eliminated in order to take advantage of these new types of commercial frameworks.
And I'll ask a kind of follow-up question. Is it safe to assume, and you can all answer this in turn, is it safe to assume you're expecting significant growth over the next 5 to 7 years in these sectors?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all coming, and it's coming as quickly as the equipment can get manufactured, actually.
Okay. Irina, you want to take the floor for a few minutes?
Absolutely, happily. I'll just pick up where Sangeeta has left off. In our plans, when we first envisioned how our market penetration would work, we assumed that light, medium duty vehicles would be the lowest hanging fruit for electrification, yet our first customers are deploying Class 6, Class 8 vehicles at their depot sites. So it is all about where various manufacturers are in terms of meeting their commitments to EV production, to EV manufacturing. And of course, satisfying the ever-growing demand in the marketplace. For us, I would say it's not simply the sectors of the market that are of interest and of strategic importance. It's also their location. It's not news to anyone on this call, I'm sure, that California remains a strategic priority because of the really forward-looking incentives and legislation and policy that exists, but it's a carrot and a stick, really to incentivize that change in the behavior and the fleet composition. Other states are following suit. We're seeing more and more public RFPs and RFIs being put out by larger municipalities and public entities for electrification. So we're following those. I would say for Electrata, while we certainly have high hopes for public infrastructure to be there for en route charging, being realistic and pragmatic, we realize that behind the fence, depot charging will continue to be the mainstay for that initial fleet electrification, at least for the next 5 years. We're really seeing that as our focus, certainly in making sure that those depots are electrifying in a very robust fashion, and that most advantage can be taken of opportunities, especially where utility incentives exist and when there's additional opportunity to build out solar and storage as well. So that's essentially our market focus. We work across vehicle classes, we work across verticals. Obviously, what already has been mentioned in the school bus sector and the transit sector, we're seeing a lot of different programs popping up, but we're still, I believe, in the very early stages of this market where customer education means a lot for this process to really take off, and customer education like this webinar about various models available in the market, including charging as a service, so that that capital burden and the performance burden and risk is removed for the fleet customer.
That's great. And sometimes you refer to it as behind the fence, and the other term I've heard is captive fleets. That's fleets that go out, do a service during the day and come back to the same fueling and operating and maintenance location. So
That's correct.
I would imagine those are very attractive to all three of you. All right, Kimberly, what is Trillium chasing after these days?
Yeah, we're chasing after all the same customers that we've been chasing after, the major fleets across the country through our relationships with our Loves team, our Loves fleet sales team. We also are, Trillium's core business is the transit customer, the captive fleet that you said, the refuse trucks, and all of the return to base sort of customers that we're used to fueling on other types of fuel. So it's really taking our same capabilities that we've had in the CNG sector, the same sort of customers that we've had there, and transitioning them or helping them to transition to zero emission. On the battery electric side for EV charging specifically, what we've been using as our lesson, as our guinea pig, is the light duty charging stations. It's very similar to what you'll see on behind the fence. It's still charging, it's still electricity. We're also trying our hand at distributed generation at some of our Loves. At about 7 Loves locations, we have solar arrays. At one of those solar arrays, we have an on-site energy storage. Right now, using that to offset the electricity bill for the store itself, which is stable. We know how much the utility bill is going to be in June versus December. What gets more interesting is when you have a charger that's publicly accessible and you don't know when that guy is going to come and charge. How do you dynamically manage the electricity that goes to that charger? How do you dynamically manage your cost of goods, the cost of electricity, so that we can make sure we're providing the most cost-effective price to the customer? All of these things help us to become smarter so that when we do it behind the fence for our customer base, we're able to bring those experiences and not utilize someone's depot, someone's fleet as a guinea pig. That would be the worst thing, that you can't get back on the road because the charger isn't working. So long story short, using the light duty market as our learning arena, as our classroom, so that we can be smarter for our captive fleet base.
Right, thank you. All right, next question, and we're just going to touch on hydrogen here. It's another form of energy. I know Trillium has dabbled here a little bit. We get this customer question from a lot of our customers that are wrestling with hydrogen versus battery electric. So the question is, the Department of Energy just released their hydrogen roadmap and outlines where and when and how many facilities they're going to start building up. How do you envision growth and evolution of the hydrogen market? And this maybe is in the context of how does that compare to battery electric charging? And are each of your firms looking at this sector? So Sangeeta, I'll just walk through each of you.
Sure. Yeah, look, I think this is a really important space for us to be looking at. I think hydrogen is a valuable potential resource for a lot of customers, for lots of operational, for the sustainability reason. I think there is some organizations have clarity around the value that could provide, but from an operational perspective, I think hydrogen is potentially very valuable. So when we're talking about some of these fleets, the range that they need in order to operate is just not conducive to battery electric vehicles, or the weather or the geographies where they're operating in really requires a different fuel source than a battery electric type of vehicle. It's not going to serve their operational needs. And fundamentally, for all of these organizations, their operational performance is absolutely critical. So first and foremost, they have to be able to serve their business need, and then they can look at making sure that they're doing that as sustainably and cost effectively as possible. So we're definitely following this. And I think Irina might have mentioned very early on about how location matters. So we're really looking at what happens with these hydrogen hubs when they get launched, and does that help to create these pockets of areas where hydrogen starts to become more economically viable. But I will tell you, at the moment, we're tracking this market, we're looking at it, we're checking to see where it's going. But our focus is making sure that anything that we do install can migrate over to a hydrogen fuel source in the future so that it's future proofed. And we just actually about a month ago announced another project with Montgomery County, and phase 1 will be battery electric buses, but phase 2 will include fuel cell electric buses, and they would like to produce hydrogen on site using a solar array that we're going to build out for them. So they're starting to think about it. I think they're an early adopter, but we'll start to see more organizations looking at this, especially as it becomes more common and more cost effective.
I heard one of you use the term distributed energy, and I was just yesterday at a hydrogen conference, and they were talking about on-site generation, zero-emission on-site generation using either hydrogen fuel cells or hydrogen engines. Interesting, a lot of interesting work going on right now. So, Reina, do you want to jump in here?
Well, I'll just maybe add to what Sangeeta has said. And my personal background is in the conventional oil and gas industry until I switched to renewables and clean mobility about 15 years ago. So I am familiar with kind of the componentry, if you will, of the entire energy balance that needs to be considered in this transition. And again, we're still in the early days of transportation transformation, I should say. So there will be multiple models that are being considered. I would say that we're, as a smaller entity, we have to stay very focused on what we do best.
Stay in the lane, right?
We have to stay in our lane. We couldn't possibly be all things to all people. So we are really focused on electric vehicles and providing the charging as a service to electric fleets. With all due respect, we also know that there are a lot of challenges, especially with larger scale transit buses, school buses, in terms of battery performance. Again, early days, and we want to make sure that market confidence remains for that transportation to electrify. And there will be parallel models going on and being put in place, I think, in the foreseeable future, again, to ensure that functional reliability and that the operation of a particular market player can continue as before. So we're realistic, watching the space, but staying in our lane around electric.
All right. And Kim, maybe you can talk for a few minutes about some of your hydrogen work. You had a little bit there in your presentation about Trillium, but where do you see this sector going?
It's a really good question. So the experience that we've had to date is we've designed and built 2 hydrogen fueling stations. The first one being a liquid hydrogen fueling station that delivers in liquid for and vaporizes it and pressurizes it and puts it into buses. So liquid hydrogen is delivered to that station on a regular basis via a truck or a tanker. The second experience that we've had is a hydrogen station that produces hydrogen on site via electrolysis. That one is going to be connected to a solar array, so it's going to be truly renewable hydrogen. There are pros and cons to both, right? The on-site electrolyzer station is a larger station, takes up more space. That station is able to fuel somewhere around 15 to 20 buses. But you control your destiny. You don't have to rely on someone to bring hydrogen to your site. So you have a little bit more control. Whereas the liquid hydrogen station, smaller station, that station with a few upgrades would be able to fill 50 buses. But you do have to depend on the hydrogen provider. All that to say, I mean, there are pros and cons to both. What I will say about hydrogen in a fleet fueling perspective is that it mimics a CNG or a diesel fueling experience more closely than EV charging does today. I think with charging advancements and battery advancements, that sentiment could change. But if you're looking for an application where you can have a similar experience to what you're used to, hydrogen may be maybe the answer. The struggle here is that electricity, there's a grid. Now we can all argue about whether or not the grid has enough power to power all the EV or the battery electric vehicles that are coming onto the market, but there is a grid. For natural gas, there's a natural gas pipeline that we're all used to. For hydrogen, the production of hydrogen is not at a place that mass deployment of hydrogen fuel cell trucks or buses would be conducive of today, but it's happening. I mean, the DOE coming out with their roadmap, having the hydrogen hubs, I foresee that there's going to be a ton more hydrogen production in this country, and then a ton more green hydrogen production in this country. So it will be an option, a very viable option for fleets in the future. So I really envision the hydrogen market growing and continuing to grow over the next decade or two. I will say it's lagging behind the battery electric kind of growth projection a bit, but I think it'll catch up.
Great comments, and you touched on something that I've seen repeatedly in different fleets, which is the advancements in technology. We're all building out these charging platforms and these fueling platforms on what is known about the technology today and what's commercially available in 2023. All of these technologies are advancing very rapidly. There's a huge amount of R&D effort going in, and what we are doing today is going to look very different in 2030 or 2040 as we continue to grow. In California here, where I'm speaking from, they're going to outlaw combustion engine sales after 2035. It's going to be a very different world, so should be interesting. All right, next question. What is the potential scope for public-private partnerships like these? Discuss levels of how these P3 operations might work. What are the assets that you might bring into play? Not just the chargers themselves, but maybe getting into vehicles, the fueling systems, the charging systems, even facilities and facility build-outs. What do you envision? How do you see these partnerships evolving over time? What are the potential for someone who's just getting into this? What are the types of services your companies can bring? Sangeeta, I'll start with you. Sorry, I'll keep rolling this.
Yeah, no worries. No, thank you. Look, I think public-private partnership opportunities will continue to grow and have a lot of potential in the marketplace. What I will say is the value that they offer, I think, is tied to a couple things. One is the transparency in the contracts. I think customers need to really understand what they're getting and what protections they have so that they can feel confident those outcomes will be delivered, and if not, that they'll be compensated appropriately so that they'll be made whole. And I think when a strong contractual framework is in place, I think customers can start to feel more comfortable with public-private partnership and start thinking more broadly. So, in the beginning, when I spoke, I talked about how we think of this infrastructure as broadly as the customer needs. And so that's why I think initially when we started working in this space, we were thinking it was really limited to, say, the energy infrastructure. And then we started lumping in the charging infrastructure, and now we're looking at full facilities. Because for a lot of customers, once they move to these new vehicles, they are going to have a different configuration space. And the existing facility just may not serve the number of vehicles that they want, or allow them to lay out how they would do the charging or the refueling in a way that's similar to how they're currently set up. And so, being able to think broadly is important. But one thing I would say is, when we talk about public-private partnerships, we're talking about this as a service model where the risk is really transferred. It is different than a leasing model or, say, an ESCO model. And I just think it's worth highlighting because now that there are so many tax credits available through the federal government, I think as a customer, it's really important that they try to capture as much of that as possible. And even if a third party captures those incentives or grants, that value should be passed through to the customer. And I think sometimes, while there is a lot of money and incentive dollars available, sometimes it can be hard to capture if you don't have familiarity with it, or maybe access to like a tax lawyer or whatever that might be. And so I think that is an area we can offer value, but I think to really scale this stuff, that value still has to be passed on to the customer.
Got it. So great comments there, and you're spot on. The IRA bills with infrastructure, Inflation Reduction Act. I'm not sure why it's called that, but there's a tremendous amount of funding coming into these sectors that clearly I would see there being a big value proposition for any client, public or private, that can tap into this type of funding. So, Irina, do you want to take a stab at this too?
Yes, and if I may offer a very brief history lesson or a look back as to how the sector has evolved over the past decade or so. In the public realm, of course, public funding has been the driver of just how many charging points do we have on the map in these great United States or even in North America. So the intention of kind of higher penetration has been obviously great. However, the execution has unfortunately led to the fact that a lot of the public infrastructure is unreliable. Back to this reliability, the recent Berkeley study of DCFC in the highest adoption, earliest adoption market in the US in the Bay Area pointed to low 70% reliability or uptime of those chargers. So this tells the unfortunate story that outside of the Tesla bubble, the charging infrastructure has not worked as it is intended. And we question whether or not the latest programs around public infrastructure actually enable and incentivize manufacturers and other players in the market to actually ensure that reliability contractually. So as a fleet service operator, of course, we contractually ensure that reliability, and that provides I would say, a very different experience for fleet. So that's the first thing I wanted to highlight. Secondly, I believe a lot of public entities, and we've seen this with recent RFPs, RFIs still continuing, kind of do have this procurement mindset of owning infrastructure, owning vehicles, kind of having their arms around everything. And we like to bring the example of Amazon Web Services into these discussions, because all of us still remember the days when the servers were stationed in every building, and an IT manager was hired to babysit the said server, service the said server, so that everyone had internet. And casually the world has transitioned to everything being on the cloud, and there does not seem to be any issue with any organization operating in this as a service environment, because it has been accepted that this is not the core competency of the great majority of the organizations. So our message to a lot of the public entities out there looking to electrify is that this private partner can really help you, number one, fill out the missing piece when it comes to funding that you're about to receive, be it for infrastructure or other components. That's the first piece. Number two is that, again, that reliability and performance should be the driving factor in how you choose your partners. And so for us, it's very important that public fleets don't get disincentivized from this transition, but rather continue on that roadmap that they've laid out. And we're there to help them make that transition happen.
Great. And Kim, how about you wrap this one up?
No, they've all said it perfectly. The long and the short of it is, when you're thinking about a public-private partnership, it can include just about whatever you want it to include, starting from design to building to the vehicles to charging as a service, energy as a service. All of these things, it really comes down to what do you need, and who, when you're partnering with someone like the entities that are on the panel with me today. It's looking at what are our experiences with that. How can we help you? What are we bringing to the table that's in addition to what it is that you have within your organization, and how can we help? And what expectations do you have for a partner like ours? Some of them will include the technology, understanding the technical, understanding the engineering, understanding maintenance, but also, I mean, your CFO would ask, what is the credit worthiness of the partner that we're looking at getting into this contract with? Because that matters a lot. I mean, my CFO asks that all the time whenever we're getting into contracts. So that there are those kind of nitty gritty type of things that we have to think about as well. So the short answer is the scope can include just about whatever you want it to include. It's just working to understand what do you need and who can provide it.
Great. All right, I'm up to my last question, so you can all relax. And we're going to try and use the last few minutes here for any audience questions we get. Hopefully I can figure out how to pull those up, but that's my issue. So the last question here is, can a P3 be less expensive than running, charging, or fueling operations in-house? Or can a P3 for fueling and charging be less risky or more reliable than running your charging and fueling in-house? And we can keep these kind of quick. So Sangeeta?
Yeah, look, I think the economics look very different at every site, but it is possible. I think one of the, for it to be less expensive and certainly less risky, I would say the value of a P3 is that risk transfer. It is meant to be a mechanism to actually simplify the complex. So if it's not less risky, I don't know that it's a good idea for a customer to do. And then in terms of how it stacks up against in-house costs, I really think it's just important to make sure it's a comparison of apples to apples. So it's, you're talking about a long-term contract, so it's important to compare costs over the long run. And sometimes that can be challenging because customers may not really have a good handle on what their costs are likely to be far, into the future for the duration of that contract. But I think if one does a comparison, the cost should be commensurate with the risk. So this is what I would say is, like, if you're going to buy a house with cash versus getting a mortgage, if you total up all those payments, the mortgage is more expensive because you're using somebody else's cash and you're paying it back over time. But you wouldn't be able to buy that house if you didn't have access to that funding and that resource. So I really think it's important to look at the risk first and foremost, and then look at what's economically viable, because you're looking at OpEx versus CapEx, which really looks very different, I think, when you're setting up budgets.
Okay. Great answer. Irina?
Yeah, so for us, charging as a service rate is something that we work on very meticulously at each site for each use case at the site. So we don't have a set CaaS rate across the board because it entirely depends on the CapEx required for infrastructure build out, on the number of vehicles, number of chargers we're bringing in, and other energy assets, and how that actually breaks down to the customer use. Our goal is to lower that CaaS price per mile or per kilowatt hour for the customer, and not to overcharge them. So unlike, again, typical procurement environments where the easiest way to buy is one charger per one vehicle, or overbuy, overinvest, and put too many DC fast chargers than the site actually requires or the use case requires, we do the opposite. We look at what is the optimal way we can deliver reliability for a particular customer use case with the lesser amount of investment, again, in quality technology, quality infrastructure. So the quality is not jeopardized because we're responsible for performance. We take on all of performance risk post-commissioning, and the customer is satisfied in being able to fulfill their operational obligations. So in most cases, we can bring the cost down of CaaS versus do-it-yourself by up to 70%. And that's significant, not just the cost of capital in terms of that initial investment, but it's also really thoroughness of design and being experts in energy and utilities and technology, bringing all of this together from the market's best practices versus going off a catalog of approved vendors or following some other template that may or may not actually fit that particular entity's use case.
I'll tag on here one question. So I would assume if you help the client get into grant funding or federal funding at some level, that just improves the equation that much more.
Absolutely. Any incentives that we secure on behalf of the customer only lower their CaaS price. Absolutely. So we will be the utility owner in most cases, but the savings will be passed on to the customer in the form of their lower CaaS. Yes.
Great. And Kim, you're like my home run hitter today, but we'll wrap up. Last question. Let's roll through this.
Okay. I'll keep it short. I think the example that Sangeeta said was the perfect example. At the end of the day, when you buy a house, a $300,000 home, if you get a mortgage, could it be more expensive? Yes. But what you're gaining by getting that mortgage, you get to keep your money in your pocket to do other things. The other thing that you're gaining is you're alleviating risk. If you need that money to do other things, you have it because of other things that are happening. What do I mean by that? Could you put in a chargers, distributed generation by your vehicles, piecemeal it, and be cheaper than doing a P3 sort of contract? You could. But there's a lot of risk in piecemealing it and learning along the way. You could absolutely be way more expensive than a P3 because you don't have all those learnings that companies like ours will have because we're doing it across the country. So at the very end of the day, what you're doing is the amount of risk that you're alleviating does support the economic decision to move into a P3. So as a fleet operator, I understand the temptation of trying to piecemeal it, but this is still new technology that's evolving. So working with organizations that are following that evolvement of technology would benefit fleets in the long run.
All right, but let me, I see we have at least one question, and maybe Abby Early, our marketing director, who helps me out with this. If there's others, she can help me out because I can't see them while I'm sharing my screen. We have contact information here for all our panelists. If you want to reach out to any of them directly, by all means. You can also reach out to me. These are companies that we work with, and that Burns Engineering does a lot of the background engineering behind these systems. So that's my marketing pitch. But I see there is one question that came in about school bus fleets and EV school bus operations. And Sangeeta, you jumped into that a little bit. Maybe you could talk. Do you have any programs there that you're doing with school bus operators? And maybe I'll ask all of you to chime in on that.
Sure. I'm not the best person to answer about school bus operators because I haven't worked with districts yet. I do think one of the challenges is around scale, and some of the largest school districts actually have third parties that own and operate their bus fleet. So there's just sort of, I think, some contractual complexity and differences with school districts. There's certainly an opportunity there. The value of electric buses could potentially be very significant. And there's a need for resilience because those kids need to get to school and the community benefits are significant. I have to believe that this type of structure can work there. I just don't have any firsthand experience to share with it at the moment.
All right. And Irina and Kim, do you have anything else to add?
I would just add that, yes, indeed, scale, not only contractual complexity, but scale of actual bus depots themselves. If it's a small school district with one or two buses, bringing the charging infrastructure required to power one or two is going to drive the price significantly up. So the school districts would probably be advised to be a little bit more collaborative in terms of putting potentially their electric fleets together and or utilizing this charging infrastructure for other fleets on a subscription basis, for example, if that's feasible. to where the school buses will still get to do their job and get to charge during the time window that they have, and then other fleets can use it in the remaining time.
Right. And Kim, anything else there?
No, I think they captured it. I want you to
Great.
have the opportunity to move to other questions.
All right. Well, I don't have anything else that I can see with it while still sharing my screen. Abby, if you can chime in if there's
Sure.
anything else
Yes.
there.
We just had a question from Joe Mack who said, how might V2G or V2X technologies benefit fleet owners or operators in the charging as a service contract?
It's a great question. And I did quite a bit of work with the city of San Antonio and their transit fleet Capital Metro. V2G is vehicle to grid, or V2X, which is vehicle to facility. And in the school bus case, where you have a very limited operation, you have these massive, what are effectively battery banks that can be used for other purposes. It can be pushing power back into the grid and basically peak shaving. You can also connect those up to critical infrastructure. One of the concepts we played around with the Capital Metro was, you might have 700 kilowatt hours of energy in a transit bus. In a power outage or emergency, you could deploy those. They're basically mobile battery packs that you could move hundreds of kilowatt hours easily to maybe pre-designated facilities. Maybe it's critical infrastructure, maybe it's a warming station or a community center, maybe it's a pumping station to keep critical infrastructure operational. I'm not aware that there's a lot of programs going here, and I know there's a lot of interest in the school bus side in this area. Again, transit would be more emergency operation, whereas school buses, there's clearly daily and time of depending on the time, whether it's summer, winter, and so forth, certainly some capacity there. I don't know if anyone else here wants to chime in. I'm rambling here.
Yeah, John, I think you captured it. The only thing I would add is, in terms of vehicle to grid, I think some of the market rules still need to be worked out depending on the territory. And so while there could be some initial value, there are new markets that are being created. And so there's additional value that's difficult to model. And because the contracts we're talking about are longer term, what I would say is, first and foremost, I like to focus on how can we serve the operational need, and then any of this additional opportunity for participating in the markets is like a nice to have, but it doesn't underpin the entire business case, because really these customers are not in the market to just participate in the wholesale markets. They're there to serve their core business. But I do find it's difficult to forecast the revenue related to V2G long term, because the market's there's not enough history there to do that.
Right. Well, we are at time. I just hugely grateful for all of your participation, my all-woman panel, our all-woman panel, and really impressive group here. Again, contact information for everybody is here on the screen. We'll be sharing this presentation. It is recorded, and we'll be happy to share this with others. But I can't thank everyone enough. Great presentations all. And look forward to working with our webinar participants and the people watching out there in the world today. We look forward to working with all of you. So thank you so much. And we'll look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you, John. Thanks for making this happen. I learned a lot too.
Thank you. Thanks, John and Abby. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.